There was a woman in the town who was known by a name that struck fear in the hearts of the locals. She was called the Giant Widow, and her reputation alone was enough to make people cross the street when they saw her coming. Her name was Abigail, though no one dared to call her by it. To the people in the town, she was simply the Giant, or the Widow, as if she was defined by these two words and nothing more. Abigail wasn't always known by these names. She had once been a young woman, full of life and dreams, but those days seemed like they belonged to someone else now. She had been married to a man who was known for his wild ways, a cowboy with a reputation that made even the toughest men hesitate. They had been a perfect match, living a life full of adventure on the open plains, but then tragedy struck. Her husband, a man who had lived by the gun, died in a violent shootout. He was gone, and Abigail was left to face the world alone. Without her husband, Abigail found herself in a difficult place. She had no family to turn to, and no one in the town was particularly kind to her. She was left to fend for herself in a world that didn't understand her. It was as though overnight she went from being a beloved woman with a family to a dangerous outcast. She didn't know what to do, and over time her anger grew. People in the town began to notice her becoming more withdrawn, more distant, and more defensive. Her once warm smile turned into a stern expression, and her eyes, which once sparkled with life, now held a cold, calculating look. Her strength became her most noticeable trait. Abigail was taller than most men in the town, with broad shoulders and hands that could lift heavy loads effortlessly. She worked with horses, taking on tasks that most women would never dream of. Whether it was breaking wild horses or hauling heavy materials for the farmers, Abigail was always up for the challenge. But there was something about her that made the townspeople nervous. It wasn't just her physical strength, it was her quiet intensity. She was a woman who had been through a lot and wasn't afraid to show it. In time, the fear grew. The townspeople, who once had seen her as a normal woman, started to whisper about her. They called her the Giant Widow, a woman who had lost everything and became dangerous because of it. They said she was too strong, too wild, and too unpredictable. They began to speak in hushed tones whenever she walked by. Some claimed to have seen her in a fit of rage, her voice thunderous, her eyes filled with fury. They feared her, and so they began to avoid her. As time went on, things only got worse for Abigail. Her once beautiful home became run down, and she found herself living on the outskirts of the town in a small cabin that no one ever visited. The isolation weighed heavily on her. Despite the strength she had, the loneliness made her feel as though she was trapped in her own mind. The whispers never stopped, and the fear from the people only seemed to grow. It was then that something drastic happened. The local sheriff, after hearing too many complaints about Abigail's behavior, decided that enough was enough. One morning, Abigail found herself captured and placed in a cage in the center of the town. It wasn't a real prison, but a wooden cage open on the sides where she could be seen by everyone. It was a form of public punishment, and the people called it a lesson to others who might follow in Abigail's footsteps. The cage was humiliating, but it didn't break her spirit. She sat inside, her arms crossed, her back straight, and her eyes scanning the crowd with quiet defiance. The people came and went, staring at her as though she were some sort of wild animal. But Abigail didn't flinch. She had endured worse, and this was just another chapter in her story. She wasn't afraid of the people who mocked her. In fact, it was their fear of her that only made her more distant. Days turned into weeks, and Abigail remained in the cage. It was clear that the townspeople were uncomfortable with her being there. They didn't know whether to feel sorry for her or to be afraid of her. They threw food at her from time to time, not out of kindness, but because they didn't know what else to do. It was as if her presence was both a source of fascination and terror. But Abigail, in her solitude, remained focused on the one thing that kept her going: her freedom. During this time, the only person who ever spoke to her was a man who appeared on the outskirts of the crowd one afternoon. He wasn't a man from the town, and he wasn't anyone she had ever seen before. His name was Samuel, and he was a rancher who had recently moved to the area. Unlike the rest of the townspeople, Samuel didn't look at Abigail with fear. Instead, he looked at her with curiosity. Curiosity about who she truly was, beyond the rumors in the cage. For days, Samuel would come to the town square, standing far away from the crowd, watching her from a distance. He never approached her, never tried to speak, but he observed her quietly. Abigail, for the first time in a long while, began to feel something stir within her. something she hadn't felt in a long time, a sense of being understood. She wasn't sure why, but Samuel's presence gave her a strange sense of peace. Over the days, he became a regular visitor. His eyes never left her, but there was no fear in them. He wasn't judging her. He was simply curious, and for Abigail, that made all the difference. One afternoon, after a long day in the cage, Abigail saw him approach, walking through the crowd of people who were gossiping and pointing. He made his way to the front, directly to the cage. The people murmured as he stepped closer to Abigail, but he paid them no mind. He stood before the cage, looking at her with a calmness that no one else had ever shown her. "Are you all right?" he asked her simply. Abigail stared at him for a long moment, not knowing what to say. No one had asked her that in years. No one had cared. "I'm fine," she replied, her voice quiet but firm. "I don't need anyone's pity." Samuel nodded, his gaze soft. "I'm not here to pity you. I just wanted to know if you needed anything." She could tell he wasn't mocking her like so many others had done. There was no judgment in his eyes, only understanding. It made her feel something she hadn't felt in a long time. Hope. And that was the moment when Abigail realized that Samuel was different from the rest of the people in the town. He saw her not as the giant widow or as a woman to fear, but as someone who deserved more than what the world had given her. The days after Samuel's visit to the cage became a turning point in Abigail's life. For the first time in a long while, someone saw her as more than just the giant widow. Samuel's kindness, his refusal to judge her based on the rumors, and his quiet curiosity left a lasting impression on her. Each time he visited, he would stand at the edge of the crowd, watching her without fear, offering small words of comfort. He never pushed her to speak or tell her story, but instead he just let her be herself. To Abigail, that was a rare gift. It wasn't long before Samuel made his decision. He had watched her for days, seen the way the people treated her, and he couldn't stand to see someone like Abigail, strong, proud, and yet trapped, suffer any longer. He knew she didn't belong in that cage, and he was determined to do something about it. One afternoon, he approached the town sheriff. There were whispers about Abigail's punishment, and Samuel had heard enough. He was a man of action, and after weighing his options, he knew what he had to do. "I'd like to buy her freedom," Samuel said firmly, standing before the sheriff. The sheriff, who had known Samuel as a steady and reliable rancher, raised an eyebrow. "You want to buy the giant widow?" the sheriff asked, surprised. "Yes," Samuel replied. "I believe she deserves more than this. She doesn't belong in a cage." The sheriff looked at him, and for a moment it seemed as if he was going to refuse. But then he saw the sincerity in Samuel's eyes. He knew the rancher wasn't trying to make a show or cause trouble. He was simply offering a chance to a woman who had been misunderstood by the entire town. The sheriff nodded slowly, then turned to arrange the details. It wasn't a decision that was made lightly. But Samuel was determined, and after some negotiation it was agreed. Samuel would pay a sum that was considered fair, and in return Abigail would be freed from her cage. No more would she be treated as a spectacle. No more would she be the subject of gossip and fear. The news spread quickly through the town, and people were shocked. How could anyone want to help the giant widow? Didn't they know how dangerous she was? Didn't they know that she had been the source of fear for so long? The idea of someone wanting to buy her freedom seemed almost absurd to them. But Samuel didn't care about their opinions. He didn't see Abigail as a threat. He saw her as a woman in need of help, a woman who deserved a chance at a life beyond the cage. On the day of her release, Samuel was there, standing at the edge of the crowd, waiting patiently. When the door to the cage opened, Abigail stepped out, her movements slow and cautious. The sunlight hit her face, and for a moment, it felt like she was emerging from a dark tunnel into a new world. The townspeople watched in silence, waiting to see what would happen. Some were curious, some were uneasy, but no one dared speak. They had all heard the rumors, but none of them truly knew Abigail. Samuel, however, didn't need to know the rumors. He only needed to know that she was free now. Abigail glanced around as she stepped out of the cage. She was used to being looked at with fear, but this time was different. There was no cage around her, no people shouting at her or judging her. She was free, but at the same time she felt uncertain. She had lived with the label of the giant widow for so long, and now, in a strange twist of fate, she was suddenly free to live however she chose. It was both a relief and a heavy burden. Samuel was the first to approach her, walking with a calm and steady gait. His eyes met hers, and for a moment neither of them said anything. They didn't need to. The understanding between them was quiet but strong. "I've bought your freedom, Abigail," Samuel said, his voice low but clear. "You're free to do whatever you want. You don't have to stay here if you don't want to." Abigail blinked, surprised by his words. She hadn't expected him to say that. She had no plans, no direction, no idea where her life would go next. For so long she had been trapped by the expectations of others, by the chains of her past. But Samuel was offering her something different, something no one else had ever given her: freedom to choose. "I don't have anywhere else to go," she admitted quietly, though a sense of pride still lingered in her voice. "I've lived here long enough. Maybe it's time for me to leave this town." Samuel nodded, understanding. "You don't have to leave if you don't want to. I have a ranch not far from here. I can use your help. You don't have to do anything you don't want to, but I can promise you one thing: you'll never be caged again." There was something in his words that made Abigail pause. He wasn't offering her a pitying glance or trying to save her. He was offering her a partnership. The idea of working with Samuel, someone who treated her like an equal, was both comforting and intimidating. She had been alone for so long, never trusting anyone, never believing that anyone could truly see her for who she was. But here was Samuel, a man who had no fear of her, a man who saw her strength as an asset rather than something to be feared. "I'll help you," Abigail said, her voice firm. "But I don't need your charity. I'll work for my keep." Samuel smiled, a warm and genuine smile that made her feel for the first time in years like she was worth something. "I wouldn't have it any other way." And so Abigail left the town behind and moved to Samuel's ranch. It wasn't a grand house, but it was peaceful. The ranch was nestled in a quiet valley, surrounded by rolling hills and open fields. There Abigail found work to do, helping Samuel with the animals and the land. It wasn't easy work, but it was honest. It gave her purpose. For the first time in years, Abigail began to feel like she was living again, not just surviving. There was no more cage, no more judgment. It was just her and Samuel working side by side. As the days turned into weeks, Abigail found herself growing stronger, not just in body but in spirit. She was beginning to believe that maybe, just maybe, there was more to life than the fear and shame that had once defined her. But there was still something inside her that lingered, something she couldn't quite name. She wasn't sure if it was the comfort of the work, the quiet peace of the ranch, or something deeper. She didn't know what it was, but every time Samuel looked at her there was a warmth in his gaze that made her heart flutter. She had never allowed herself to feel anything for anyone, especially not after her husband's death. But Samuel was different. He treated her with respect and kindness, never once pushing her to be something she wasn't. One evening, after a long day of work, as the stars began to shine above, Samuel and Abigail sat by the fire outside the ranch house. It was then that Samuel spoke, his voice low but clear. "I know you've been through a lot," he said quietly, "and I don't want to rush you, but I'd like to ask you something." Abigail turned to look at him, curiosity in her eyes. "Will you marry me?" Samuel asked, his eyes gentle but filled with hope. Abigail's heart skipped a beat. It was the last thing she had expected, but as she looked into Samuel's eyes, she realized something. She had never felt so at peace, so safe in her entire life. She didn't answer immediately, but for the first time in a long while she smiled, a smile that was soft, open, and full of hope.